Senator Brown, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Barry.
There haven't been any leadership changes, resignations that you want to tell us about?
No, not at all. We'll have our next spill after the next election. It's all open up then, and I guess I'll get more comprehensive questioning. This is really part of the evolution of the press gallery's thinking for this new said paradigm in government where the Greens are the growing entity in Australian politics, and they're starting to take notice, and that's a good thing.
I suppose it shows you can still keep secrets in politics, but is it true that Sarah Hanson-Young got just the one vote?
Oh, well, I'm not, and we've made a commitment not to give the votes, but it was a clear majority for Christine Milne. I'm very pleased. She's a great deputy leader. Sarah Hanson-Young's doing a great job in her portfolios, and we've got much more than that, so I'm very happy.
OK, the next battleground is the Victorian election. What are your ambitions in Victoria? What do you think you can achieve?
Well, to give the voters of Victoria an option to Labor and Liberal, and they certainly need it. We've got a great range of candidates. We've got good policies. We've got a good performance from the three incumbent upper house members who are Greens in the Victorian Parliament. And as with Adam Bant, who's already shown what a remarkably fine representative for Melbourne he is in the House of Representatives, if we can have Brian Walters elected out of Melbourne and his colleagues from other seats in the inner city area, it'll be a good thing for all Victorians. There'll be a bit more life, innovation and responsible foresight going into planning for Victoria in the coming years.
Now, you mentioned Brian Walters, the candidate for Melbourne. Front page lead in the Herald Sun this morning. He's a barrister and he's defending the brown coal industry. Is that an embarrassment for you?
No, it would be an embarrassment if he wasn't. The ethics of this profession, and this seems to have escaped, the ethical dimension seems to have escaped both the Herald Sun and Bronwyn Pike, is that you take the case that's brought to you. Otherwise you would have people who were defenceless in situations like this. Brian's a very, very ethical. He's a former chair of Liberty Victoria. He's put a lot of effort into civil liberties, into people who have been on the receiving end of big corporate efforts, and no wonder he's in demand because he's respected. Because of his great record in the courts in Victoria defending all and sundry who needed his help. It's a very ethical thing. I haven't seen anything in the Herald Sun about whether or not Rupert Murdoch's spoken up about the 10,000 or so miners killed in accidents in China, where Rupert's got quite considerable ambition, if not actual investment. But maybe that's an ethical comparison we need to make as we go down the line.
Yeah, because you mentioned Bronwyn Pike, the minister, who's the member in that seat. She's called him a hypocrite. The State Secretary said the Greens always talk about dirty coal, but it's obviously not dirty enough to stop him seeking to profit from it.
Well, this is Labor saying break the ethics, break the rules. Don't be an ethical barrister or we'll get you. The case, by the way, Barry, is sub judice, but it'll be interesting to see what the result of it is. But I think it's very, very low politics by Bronwyn Pike and by the Labor Party, and I guess we'll see more of it. But this is really, it's a backhanded compliment to Brian Walters and to his colleagues who are standing that they're getting this desperate, that they're getting into this sort of campaign. Whereas Bronwyn might be better if she concentrated on putting forward some new ideas on health, housing, transport and unemployment in Victoria, and that's certainly what the Greens will be doing in her absence.
Now, the Greens are polling 18-19% in Victoria, depending on what poll you look at. Martin O'Shannessy from Newspoll said this during the week, that if the trends of the last two election cycles continue at the same pace, the Greens in Victoria could replace Labor as the major party of the left. Is that something you would ever dream about?
Yeah, dream about, because I've always said we're not a faction or a preference machine, Barry. We are real players in politics, and you'll remember that the Labor Party 100 years ago split the Whigs and Tories, and we ended up with Labor and Liberal, and we've had that for a century, but they've lost their way. It's very difficult to tell the difference between the two parties on very many issues affecting average citizens. Look at transport. look at power prices from that desalination plant in Victoria, which we see in the papers are going to double again. The Greens opposed that quite sensibly, but the big end of town and Labor have got together in a ruinous policy on water, including that one. And the Greens are very much needed on the floor of the Parliament. And as with Adam Bant, if Brian Walters gets into the Parliament and his colleagues with him, they will make a very positive difference for Victorians.
But at this stage, though, is it fair to say they're not exactly embracing your policies? It's still a protest vote, or if not so much a protest vote, they're trying to make a statement.
No, they're real candidates who are going to be real parliamentarians. And this is what the press doesn't get. I mean, that it's not a parking of a vote, it's not a protest vote. That's demeaning of the actual intellect of the voters of Victoria to suggest that has happened with the election of a Senator, Richard Di Natale, and Adam Bant. It wasn't. It was a mature vote and it's carrying through. People like what they see. Another issue that's in the offing is the fate of the forests of Victoria. We're seeing progress towards ending the destruction of old-growth forests in Tasmania. Not an inkling of that in Victoria, although we may see something along those lines as we go to the election, because but Labor's done nothing about the wholesale destruction, although 80% of people in Victoria want that destruction stopped. So it's and on economic and employment grounds, it would be a good time for the Brumby government to have acted on it, but it hasn't.
Now, you say you don't like preference deals, but they're going to happen anyway, aren't they, in the run-up to the Victorian election?
Well, I'll be interested to see where the preferences do go. I mean, it's a question for Mr Brumby. Is he going to put the Liberals ahead of the Greens? And for Mr Baillieu, is he going to put Labor ahead of the Greens? And I think they'd lose a lot of kudos with their own voters if that were to happen. But I know from the federal election, Barry, that something like 80% of Victorians who voted Green did put their preferences back across to the Greens, 20% put them across to the Liberals. I think it really should be a matter for the voters to make up their own minds. But, of course, parties give indications. It doesn't seem to me to alter very much where the preferences go. But it is very, very important that we talk about preferences and the voters understand the power is with them to put their preferences where they want to.
Yeah, but the point you just make is true, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what the parties might formally do, but in the end, it's pretty much an 80-20 split.
That's right, and, you know, John Howard came into the fray during the week he got countermanded very quickly, but to talk about the Greens being a bigger threat than Labor. What's that mean? It means the Greens are doing a better job than Labor, and John Howard always gave his preferences in his many years in office to the Greens ahead of Labor. And you have to do what they do and not necessarily what they say in politics.
It seems the Catholic Church too is saying that the Greens are a bigger threat than Labor. Archbishop Dennis Hart in Melbourne has effectively cautioned against voting for the Greens. How do you feel about that?
Well, no worry. I mean, Archbishop Pell had a good go at me during the election, federal election, and I don't think did any good as far as Catholic voters and Christian voters who can think for themselves. The Greens have embraced Christian ethics, and I get back again to the ethics of the legal profession, now under assail from the Labor Party. But when it comes to voluntary euthanasia, yes, the Greens brought that legislation into the Victorian Parliament and it got voted down largely by the weight of Labor and Liberal. There was a cross, of course, but votes, even though the polls show 80% of Victorians are in favour of that. Same when it comes to same-sex marriage, Barry, and indeed abortion. These are issues where the Greens represent the majority point of view, and I welcome the Catholic Church or the Presbyterian Church or the Buddhists, anybody having a say in that. We're a free and open democracy, but it really opens up to public attention the fact that the Greens are a 21st century party trying to drag the other parties out of their last century thinking on so many issues.
But let's look at the way that they frame it, though, when you mention euthanasia and abortion. They say that life is the greatest gift we can have. They point to those policies and they suggest that the Greens do not place enough value on life.
Yes, but of course what they're wanting to do in terms of euthanasia is dictate to people who are suffering the indignity and pain of a terminal illness that they shall suffer, and to deprive those persons of their ability to ask their doctors to, with their families, help them have a dignified end when there is no hope of recovery. And that's why 80% of Australians support it, and a very small minority are with the Catholic bishops thinking on this one. And we've just seen the very conservative state of Washington in the US through a referendum, despite a massive campaign by the same interests, adopt euthanasia because they look next door at Oregon and seen after many years that it's functioning very well without all the threats and horror stories that the opponents would have it, and it is giving people dignity and their own ability to determine their own affairs when they're terminally ill and they want to be deprived of the indignity and suffering that may be ahead of them, which these contra advocates want to say, you shall suffer that indignity. Well, I think that ought to be a matter of a person's own discretion, given that they are terminally ill and that all the now well-tried and true legal rules are put in place.
Now, it seems you might come up against both major parties on the issue of asylum seekers and the question of releasing families, children, into the community. It seems they want to leave the discretion with the minister, but you want it mandated. Yes,
but the parties have agreed that children should be released from mandatory detention, except for a very short period of assessment. All the parties agree on that, and Sarah Hanson-Young's point of view is, well, let's legislate it so it isn't left to a minister to decide for or against that down the line. Seeing we have tripartisan agreement on this, let's have it legislated and brought into law. So it's really acting on what the parties are saying again they would do and they agree with. And the Parliament's there to make laws. One of the things that's happening here, Barry, is that it's being recognised that it isn't just the domain of government to make laws, that they can come from private members, and they're very often on issues which have large public backing, have a great deal of common sense. But for one reason or other, the executive wants to keep to itself, and that's why this legislation is a trailblazer from Sarah Hanson-Young, much as the legislation from Adam Bandt to ensure that in future wars Parliament is consulted, is not something the big parties might want, because they want the executive in control, not the full suite of elected representatives as our democracy and our constitution provides for.
But doesn't it make sense to allow for some flexibility to deal with a situation where it might be unwise to release certain people into the community?
Yes, and all such legislation allows for that flexibility. There is always the exception that ministerial discretion will take place. The legislation like this is subject to committee scrutiny and to input from not just community groups but from legal advisors. I fixed up my legislation allowing, now before the Parliament, to allow the territories the right to legislate on euthanasia because of very good legal suggestions, and no doubt this legislation will get the same scrutiny and may well be improved, but the important thing is that it's there for all parties to consider. And if the government and opposition are saying that children shouldn't be kept in detention, then they'll be supporting Sarah Hanson-Young's legislation, you would think.
Senator Brown, thanks for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks, Barry.